Hargreaves.
Who is it?
Mr. Forgetful.
Mr. Forgetful. So we're going to have a story today about
Mr.
Forgetful. Okay.
The Mistermen started out small, just 6 books, not much larger than a child's hand, which hit the shops in the summer of 1971, priced at 20p each. Their author, Roger Hargreaves, was an advertising man, tired of advertising, looking for a way to spend more time with his kids. It turned out to be the start of a multi-million-pound global brand, one that today shows little sign of feeling its age. In the first decade of the 21st century, the only authors to sell more books in the UK were J.K. Rowling and Dan Brown, author of the Da Vinci Code. But for Adam Hargreaves, who took over the Mistermen when his father died in the late 80s, it's personal.
I was probably only 6 or 7 at the time, so I don't actually remember it. But I know my dad has told this as a story of how the idea sort of started, was that I asked him what a tickle looked like, one of those ridiculous questions that small children ask their parents and there's no particular answer to. But for my dad, it sort of sparked off the idea of Mr. Tickle and actually taking a human characteristic and then visualising it and creating a story about it. So I think that was a sort of a start point. I mean, he was in advertising, so ideas were his forte, really. And he'd spent a lot of his life up to that stage, although he worked in advertising in London, trying to create strip cartoons mainly. That was his real ambition. He wanted to be a strip cartoonist. He wanted to find a new career that also meant he didn't have to commute to London every day. I think he was rather keen to avoid that. Yes.
Mr. Tickle reached in through the window with that extraordinarily long arm of his, went up behind a little boy called Peter, and tickled him on the back of his neck. Peter giggled out loud. "Stop that giggling at once," said the teacher sternly.
So do you think he did do a convincing tickle? Does Mr. Tickle look like a tickle in your view? I
think so. Well, to me, I can't imagine a tickle in any other way, but having spent sort of 20-odd years drawing him, I kind of fixated on that now. I couldn't imagine any other way.
Mr. Tickle waited a minute, then reached in through the window again. Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air and turned round very quickly to see who was there. But there was nobody there. Mr. Tickle grinned, a mischievous grin.
Was it easy for him to publish the stories? Was he surprised that they did so well?
I think it was difficult for him to find a publisher. In fact, as far as I'm aware, he sent it off to a number of them, major publishers at the time, and got turned down by them all. And it was as much luck as anything that they finally got published, because he met an old friend of his who was a printer, Jack Thurman. Jack asked him what he was doing. My dad told him he was writing some children's stories, and Jack said, "If you write them, then I'll print them." And that's where it started.
Do you know how the original TV series came about?
I think it was 2 friends of his in advertising who worked in the actual creative side of advertising, so they knew all the film and camera work stuff. And I think talking between them, they decided to have a go at making a TV series. So they actually created a company to do that and then approached the BBC, and the BBC said, "Yes, we'd like to take on the series." It was a great start point. And, Arthur Lowe was also, his involvement happened in a similar sort of way, those sort of happy accidents. I mean, I think he was in recording an advert with my dad, and they just got him to read out a Mistermen book while he was there, just to sort of test it out and see how it sounded. And he did such a great job that they got him on board straight away.
On the other side of the world, there is a country called Happyland, where the trees are 100 feet tall, and where the sun shines hotter than here. And, as you might very well expect, everybody who lives in Happyland is as happy as the day is long. Wherever you go, you see smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happyland. And as well as all the people being happy, all the animals in Happyland are happy as well. If you've never seen a mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, you go to Happyland.
At a similar time, actually, although I was a bit younger, my dad was doing, Michael Flanders was doing the voices for the Barber Papa, and it was a sort of similar thing that you got a bit blasé about the fact that their voice or their face was on television, and then you almost forget that that's not the normal
Yes, I think I was certainly like that. He wanted a success. I mean, there was sort of no bones about that. I mean, he was ambitious. He met another chap called Richard Cully through some friends of his who was a licensing agent, and once they got chatting, they kind of started to see the potential of it all. And I think it was 1974 my dad signed up a licensing agreement with Richard, and he was our agent all the way through to when we sold the company in 2004. So that was an extraordinary sort of business relationship over that many years.
But I mean, just to spell it out, what did that mean if you do a licensing agreement?
Well, basically, you license normally the visual of the character, and that's put on a product, whether it be a T-shirt, yogurt pot, baked bean can, whatever it might be, and then you get paid a royalty for the use of your character or idea on that product. Particularly nowadays, it's invariably the most successful money-spinning part of the children's character development, side to the publishing and TV.
Now, those of you who have children will know that the headaches caused by youngsters asking for Mr. Man yogurts or Honey Monster cereal. It seems that the children who love these characters can't get enough of them. And all sorts of cartoon characters have now given their names to food, toys, games, in fact, just about anything that's sellable. And for the advertising world, this way of getting to children's hearts and minds has now become very big business indeed. £150 million worth every year. And in London, a special conference opens tomorrow to discuss this booming business of character merchandise, as it's called.
And the yogurts were particularly...
Yes, I mean, that was...
I remember that.
I mean, I think Mr. Men might have sort of pioneered that whole sort of food licensing spat that there was, especially through the 80s and, well, late 70s, 80s.
There was a time when you couldn't get any normal yogurt.
Yes, I think it seems to turn around now, I think.
Branded yogurts may have been something new in the 70s, but the idea of branded books for children goes way back. Peter Hunt, Professor Emeritus in Children's Literature.
I think writing for a brand is an important thing in children's literature, and it goes right back to the first children's books in the 18th century. It's nothing new. And so if you look at Beatrix Potter, for example, who's a very respectable series writer, she produced little books designed for children's hands with a standard format all the way through and marketed them in a very active way for the period. Enid Blyton's Noddy books, for example, were conceived as a series with logos and layout and signatures and everything else on them so that they could be bought as a set. So right from the beginning, children's books have, well, like adults' books really, relied on the series concept. The difference with the Mr. Men books is that, like Beatrix Potter, they are individual characters. They are not a series. And so this idea of marketing a series with different characters but the same format has been imitated a great deal. Now, that is a basic marketing thing that's gone back 3 or 4 centuries, and I think what Roger Hargreaves did was to exploit it to its absolute zenith.
The Mr. Men were, and are, a marketing triumph. Maybe you still have the odd Mr. Men pencil sharpener knocking around the house to show for it. But as with Disney, selling to children on a grand scale comes with baggage attached. There's the worry that young minds are being exploited, even distorted. Children's author Michael Rosen.
For a long time, children's books have had another world around them, if you like. So, if you just take Winnie the Pooh, it wasn't long before people were trying to make teddy bears that were like Winnie the Pooh. If you go back and look at children's books at the beginning of the 20th century, there were other merchandising things, whether it was posters or other forms of the book. In a way, there are very few books that we ever come to in the children's book world, as it were, not surrounded by other stuff, whether that's TV, film, whether it's pencils or pencil sharpeners or whatever. So in a way, you have to say that a lot of children's books, particularly for young children, they live in a kind of intermediate world. That's to say they jump between different media. Many books are now perceived in this intermediate way. Now, one way of looking at that is to say this is all just a form of exploitation, and you're just filling the imaginative world with commodities. It's a commodification of the imagination. That's what some people have said. The key thing is how children make meanings. We often think the book contains the meaning, but it's the child who's making the meaning. Now, if they have a duvet cover, pyjamas, a pencil and the book, they have to make meanings. They have to make the connections between those things. So that's really the bit that you have to get into. Is that are they making interesting meanings? Are they making important meanings? Or Is it some rather passive way in which somehow or other they're dominated by the forms, by the commodities in question, or are they really being creative with them? That's the question you have to ask, I think.
I've got one more idea, said Mr. Robinson. I know somebody who writes stories for children. Perhaps you could work for him. So the following day, Mr. Robinson took Mr. Small to meet the man who wrote children's stories. Can I work for you? Mr. Small asked the man. Yes, you can, replied the man. Pass me that pencil and tell me all about the jobs you've been doing. And then I'll write a story about it. I'll call it Mr. Small, he added. But children won't want to hear a story all about me, exclaimed Mr. Small. Yes, they will, replied the man. They'll like it very much. And you did, didn't you?
In 1988, Roger Hargreaves won the European Licensing Award for outstanding contribution to the licensing industry. He had quite literally shown them how it was done. But then suddenly he was gone, and no one knew what the Mr. Men would do without him. Your father died very young in 1988, at just 53. What happened to the brand then?
Well, it was, I guess, sort of fairly rudderless. I mean, my dad was the Mr. Men. He obviously had Richard Cullen, his licensing agency and publishing company, but all the sort of business creative decisions were still his, so there wasn't as if he'd created his own company. He still worked on his own. So it was pretty much rudderless. I started off, to help my mum out and sort through the papers and all that sort of thing. And it grew from there, really. The more I got into it, the more intrigued I was by it and interested in it. And then the creative side started to sort of kick in, because I've always drawn and I like drawing and have a talent that way. So there were designs coming through for licensed product and that sort of thing, and I was able to start putting my own input on that, which grew into a full-time job, actually drawing the characters and then even writing,
that was new
books.
New Mr. Men characters? Or...
Yeah, I mean, it was a long time before I felt that I was in a sort of position to be able to actually write or create new characters for the series. My whole style of drawing is quite different to my dad, so I had to learn to draw the Mr. Men. It was quite. It sounds ridiculous because they're so simple, but it took me a long time to really feel like I was starting to master it.
This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump walking down the street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Bump!
The simplicity is a bit of a myth, because if you look at the pictures, they look to us adults very simple. You have a circle which represents a body and a face at the same time. But if you think about it, for a child to connect that to a real person is quite a large intellectual leap. Now, children can do that at a very early age, but it means that somehow the pictures are appealing to a very deep psychological level in them, and they're requiring quite a lot of interpretation. So the simplicity is a bit of a myth.
Children's writing is one of those things that everyone seems to have a go at, be it Madonna, Sarah Ferguson or Ricky Gervais. But like those little drawings, it's a lot more complicated than it looks. Peter Hunt again.
Good children's literature, I think, should be to inform, educate, and especially to open the mind of the child to new and different things. And therefore it should be psychedelic in the proper sense. Very little of it actually is, because a lot of it is designed to satisfy the adult rather than satisfy the child. In the case of the Little Miss books, Mr. Men books, you could argue that because of their very range and their colourfulness and the numbers of them, then a child who's collecting them could be introduced to a wide range of materials. On the other hand, you could argue that because it falls back on things like magic and magicians and clichés like that, it's not actually expanding the mind so much. So I think the Little Miss books and the Mr. Men books have a sort of intermediate place in the literary continuum, as it were, that they partly introduce children to something new if they're not familiar with it, but they can also restrict their ideas of what life is like and what the possibilities of books are, because they are somewhat cliched and stereotyped.
I think tone is really one of the hardest things to get right with children. It's very, very hard, and the whole of the world of children's literature has struggled with this ever since it first began. You know, you look at the very first books, and they're very, very instructional. Another side of it, they were very, very religious and didactic, and in a way that kind of hangs over us. It's a sort of do-goodery. At the end of the day, most books for children are, in that kind of memorable New York phrase, they're about making nice. What we want is we want our children just to be good and to be nice and to think good things. Now, quite often we conceal that, but at the heart of most children's books there's that idea, make nice.
That's it. I've had enough, cried Mr. Uppity suddenly. I'm fed up with you, Mr. Perfect. And do you know why? I'll tell you. I've discovered that there's a most enormous, unbearable, exasperating fault with you. Would you be so kind as to tell me what that might be? Asked Mr. Perfect, as politely as ever. Don't you understand? Cried Mr. Uppity. Your fault is that you have no faults.
How did you decide to finally sell? Because you managed it from 1988 until 2004,
yeah.
so that's 16 years.
Yeah, I guess it was like all of these things. There were numerous reasons for that. Partly was becoming aware that you could actually sell intellectual property rights. I'd never really kind of occurred to me until not long before that. So
I get the impression your dad would have thought maybe.
I do. Yes, I suspect that he would have been much quicker off the mark in that respect. But it was also the licensing industry had sort of become a very different kind of industry to the one, certainly where my dad started, but even where I started. And the competition was a lot fiercer, and also most children's characters' rights were owned by corporations. And so obviously the money that they could invest in TV series and the like meant that they were competing on a completely different scale to us.
The owners of Noddy have added the Mistermen to their portfolio of children's characters. The entertainment group Corian has paid £28 million for the Hargreaves organisation and Mr Films, which together own the rights to the Mistermen. The company says it's planning to reinvigorate...
Why did you go with Corian, and how did it work out that you sold to them?
Corian, was a very natural choice because they built up a portfolio of intellectual property rights and shown how carefully they'd taken those characters and built them up. So they were very well placed to sort of take on something like the Mistermen.
But that was no strings attached in the sense of, did you try and have any control over what they could do afterwards with the brand?
No, that was part of the deal, that they were going to take it to the next level as they wanted to.
Cigarettes, Mistermen.
Well, we never had
underwear.
Never had any fear of that, because to have done that would have destroyed what they were buying, or spending a lot of money on. So in that respect, didn't have any fear of that.
It was a lovely day in Misterland, and Mr. Happy was going for a walk. He walked and walked and walked, until he found himself lost on the wrong side of Misterland. That's when he spotted little Miss Chav with her 4 children. "Excuse me," Mr. Happy said, "could you tell me how to get home?" "Off, you," replied little Miss Chav. The next people he asked for directions were Mr. Happy Slapper and little Miss Asbo. They kicked and punched poor Mr. Happy and laughed as they filmed him on their camera phones.
The Mistermen have always been good for a gag, usually involving a certain loss of innocence, as in that clip from Dead Ringers. The Sun once suggested updating the lineup to include Mr. Yardie, Mr. Drug Dealer and Little Miss Supermodel. At Corian, they know they can't control everything with a Mr. attached, but they try to keep it clean. Cheryl Gotthelf, Mistermen brand manager.
Everybody at our company, of course, because we are brand guardians, keeps their eyes out. But we have a wonderful product approvals team that literally reviews everything that is submitted to us for all products, and in multiple stages. So it's not just once or twice that we look at something, but many, many stages until the actual production sample is complete. We also have actually a very dedicated legal team that is committed to protecting our brand worldwide, and so together our brand teams and our legal teams are constantly vigilant about taking a look at what's on the market and making sure that nothing is inappropriate. We take that responsibility very seriously. The other thing is that Mr. Men is actually a brand for all ages. And so whether it's an infant in their crib or it's somebody who's recently retired and definitely needs a Mr. Lazy t-shirt, Mr. Men is one of those unique brands that speaks to all generations.
They're really targeted to sort of 3, 4, 5-year-olds, but quite often you'll go into a Waterstones store and you'll find a group of adults, quite often students, and they'll be looking for a present for their best mate as a joke or maybe for their girlfriend.
Sarah Clark, children's buying manager at Waterstones.
And I think it's quite telling that one of the best-selling Little Miss stories is Little Miss Bad, and I don't think it's necessarily kids who are buying that title.
Someone had sawn Mr. Forgetful's car in half. Fortunately, Mr. Forgetful did not get upset. He simply thought that he must have forgotten the other half and left it at home. And someone had sneaked into Little Miss Neat's house while she was away on holiday and left all the taps running. Little Miss Neat did get upset. Nobody knew who had done all these things, but Little Miss Sunshine had a very good idea who was behind it all. Little Miss Bad, she murmured to herself. Little Miss Bad was not good. Far from it. In fact, about as far as you can get, which is a long way.
I think part of the huge appeal around the Mr. Men is nostalgia for the parents. They were first published in 1971, so there's a huge amount of people who have now got toddlers and they just want to share the books that they loved when they were kids with their own children. But I think the other reason, probably more importantly, is kids absolutely adore them. They love the collectability, they like the really bold illustrations, the comedic and slightly anarchic stories. They're just a real must for every child's bookshelf. They're by far our most popular character, so fads like things like Teletubbies come and go, they'll have huge sales, but Mr. Men are always there, and they're always right up there at the top. Mr. Men sell 3 million copies pretty much every single year, so they're absolutely massive in the UK.
Mr. Men's growth has actually been nothing short of remarkable. The number of licensees worldwide, which has now reached over 200, has grown exponentially since we purchased the franchise in 2004. We are in more territories worldwide than we've ever been, and we've actually expanded into all forms of media, whether it's our website, the television show, or it's the explosion of Mr. Men in social networking sites like Facebook and YouTube. There's pretty much not a category where Mr. Men doesn't exist.
The all-new Mr. Men television series began in 2008 with redesigned characters featuring in short comedy sketches. It's certainly a far cry from the days of Arthur Lowe.
Among the many unsung heroes in Dillydale are our doctors and nurses. Whether in a tiny doctor's office or a great big hospital, these Mr. Men and Little Misses dedicate themselves to making your boo-boos all better.
How you feeling, Mr. Bump?
The usual, Mr. Strong. Bumped and bruised.
Oh, sorry to hear that. Well, let's check your vital signs. Your blood pressure's perfect. And your temperature is absolutely normal. I think you're gonna be just fine, Mr. Bump.
Oh, good to know.
Do you think your dad would be pleased with what's happened to the brand since the family lost control of it?
Yeah, I think he'd be very excited about the fact that there's a brand new TV series out there, and as I said, he was ambitious for the success of his idea. So I think to see Mr. Men growing as a global brand would have pleased him enormously. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that he was so go-ahead on wanting to do those things. You don't have the normal dilemma that people might have who've inherited that kind of legacy where you don't want to commercialise it. Because that, as you said, that was the goal from day one was to commercialise it.
Yeah, so, I mean, so that certainly made selling the property rights simpler. There wasn't as if there was you felt there was a voice over your shoulder saying this is not what I wanted. I think he would have been excited all round by that sort of prospect.
Mr. Cheerful was never without a smile. From breakfast time in the morning to his bath time at night, Mr. Cheerful beamed from ear to ear. He was even happy when it rained. And on a sunny day, his smile was even brighter and sunnier than the sun. Everybody around him couldn't help but feel cheerful. Even the flowers smiled when Mr. Cheerful walked past.
How much involvement do you have now?
Purely creative and really centred around sort of creating new books. I don't have any involvement in the business side now.
Your dad's name is still on all of these books. Roughly, what share of the books that I could find piled up in the shop are actually written by
I've created 8 new characters. So, I mean, the bulk...
Mr. Men characters.
Mr. Men and Little Miss characters, yeah. So the bulk is still very much his. And I always felt that it was his idea and his name should be on the front. I mean, he is now synonymous with the brand. It's Mr. Men and Roger Hargreaves. I mean, the only thing we dropped was the by Roger Hargreaves, so it's now just Roger Hargreaves.
Why do you think they're so successful?
I think the key factor is that they are based on human characteristics. You know, each one of them is a little bit of all of us, and I think that's the real bit that touches people. You know, everybody knows somebody who's accidental and bumping into things the whole time, or, you know, tickling people, or happy or grumpy. You know, they are part and parcel of what we are, so I think that's really what makes them work. I think that's the real attraction.
Do you have a favourite one?
Well, I have 2 favourites. I like Mr. Bump visually. I love drawing Mr. Bump. But I like the Mr. Silly story. That's my favourite story.
I'm trying to remember what the silly story is. I remember Mr. Bump quite well.
Well, he lives in Nonsense Land, and they have a competition to see who can win the Nonsense Cup each year. And he wins the competition by painting a tree green, all the leaves on the tree green. I just think it's such a wonderfully daft but amusing idea. It's really fun.
A green tree, exclaimed the king. Who ever heard of a green tree? A green tree, shouted the crowd. How silly! And they started to applaud wildly. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. The king held up his hands. I think, he said, that this is the silliest idea I have ever heard of. And therefore, I award the Nonsense Cup to Mr... What did he say his name was? To Mr. Silly. The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went quick with pride. And a bird, perched high up in the branches of the silly green tree, looked down. Woof, it said, and flew off, backwards.
Mr. Strong, because he's a square and he's got my favourite colour. Mrs. Naughty, because she kept on doing naughty things. Mr. Tickle, you have to tickle everyone.
Because you like tickling people. Makes them laugh, it makes them happy, doesn't it?
Let's Go to Misterland was presented by Stephanie Flanders and the producer was Lizzie Foster.